So welcome everybody. So today's webinar is what is a human-centered electricity system? My name is Kelvin Say. I'm a research fellow at the Energy Transition Hub in the University of Melbourne, and where I specialize in DR market integration. So before we begin, please join me in acknowledging the traditional owners of the various lands from which we are joining this webinar, and in paying my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. So this webinar is being hosted by the Climate Energy College and the Energy Transition Hub, and is the fifth in a series of 8 webinars on consumer-centric energy, and is sponsored by the Victorian Clean Technology Fund. So this webinar is being recorded, and this recording will be made available on the Climate Energy College and Energy Transition Hub websites by tomorrow. So the later part of this webinar will be run as a Q&A session. So please submit questions at any time using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And please upvote questions that you particularly like to be answered. So now I'd like to introduce Mark Paterson. So Mark Paterson is the Chief Strategy Officer of Strategy Global and Managing Director of the Strategy in Australian Pacific practice. As a recognised thought leader in whole of system grid transformation, Mark has played key roles supporting Australia's transition to become one of the world's most deeply decentralised electricity systems at CSIRO, Energex and Horizon Power. So Mark led the CSIRO ENA Electricity Network Transformation Roadmap project, which involved over 200 stakeholders in co-developing transition pathways for the 2017 to 27 decade. This national project spanned customer, technology, economic, tariff, business model, and regulatory domains, and was supported by extensive techno-economic modelling. An integrated suite of agreed actions was delivered, and over 100 billion Australian dollars of economic value was identified through whole system optimisation. So Mark is the co-chair of Clean Energy Council's Distributed Energy Leadership Forum and an associate member of the Gridwise Architecture Council at the US Department of Energy, and is focused on transactive energy systems. He's also the Emeritus Chair of the Australian-New Zealand Standard 4755 suite of demand response standards. So without further ado, the floor is now yours, Mark. Oh, sorry, we can't hear you.
Okay, that might work. Okay, apologies. All right, thanks for that introduction, Kelvin, and I will just share some slides here. Let's see. The wonderful world of webinars that we're all living in. Okay, hopefully that's visible to you. All right, so as Kelvin mentioned, my topic is perhaps a little provocative of asking the question, what is a human-centered electricity system? Probably traditionally, and certainly in the last 30 years, we haven't necessarily thought of electricity systems as being particularly human-centered. They have been a utility essential service, and I guess we don't always think of utility essential services in those kind of terms. So I guess I'm grappling with that topic today, and hopefully you find it interesting. So if I was to, and I'm just getting my slides to work here, just a little bit about Strategens. So Strategens is a global professional services firm that specialises in accelerating whole system transition to decarbonised and human-centred energy systems, headquartered in California, offices in Oregon and here in Australia, and working globally. So I'll start with this question, and it's really just asking, what do the following once powerful and wealthy industries have in common? And I'll just scroll through a few images, and you can probably pick up the theme. Whoops. Surprisingly, rail was once the industry to be in if you wanted to be rich and famous. It was at the centre of industrialising economies, and certainly for the rich and famous. You've got beloved print media and print newspapers, taxis. Anyone want to buy a taxi plate at all? So we're looking for themes here. Obviously Kodak, we're familiar with Kodak and the Kodak moments. and last but not least, good old Blockbuster. So what are those entities or sectors, what do they have in common, is really the key question. And we're really trying to frame this up in terms of, well, why even ask the question about a human-centered electricity system or energy system, for that matter? Well, the fundamental commonality across those very different sectors is that they all forgot what it was to create value. So the core elements of creating value. And as Theodore Levitt from Harvard once said famously, people don't want to buy a quarter-inch drill, they want a quarter-inch hole. And, you know, it's a beautiful quote in terms of when human beings are making purchase decisions, they're ultimately, perhaps another way of putting it, Clayton Christensen would put it that people ultimately hire solutions, hire products to solve their particular problems or address key jobs that they want done. In this case, they want a hole, and whether that's via a drill bit or some other means is perhaps a secondary concern. So ultimately, another way of thinking about this is that we are living in the disruption generation, as it's called, and it has been called that for some while now. One thing that I think is very interesting about the disruption generation is that we all, I think, have a tendency to desire a beautiful, steady state that we can relax and settle into. And so hopefully after this disruption's over, we've created the new secret sauce. We can settle back into a steady state comfort zone for the next 20 or 30 years. Well, the reality is that the disruptors are continually being disrupted. And as you'll see there, iTunes obviously disrupted traditional music stores, and iTunes itself has been significantly disrupted by platform-based solutions such as Spotify. So we are in a, if you like, now a culture, a commercial culture of continuous disruption. And so in that context, the choice really is either disrupt yourself or be disrupted by others. I mean, I know this language can be a little bit cute in the sense that it can be overused and perhaps it becomes MBA speak, if you like. But I think the reality is that we're living in and through a very transformational period in terms of the way that commercial enterprise operates and indeed society operates. And when you take that down to the grid, obviously the 20th century grid has served us extremely well. And it has done that in terms of its original design of being a one-way flow of electricity, essentially a bulk delivery system to largely passive customers. And that 20th century grid is transitioning to become a multi-directional system of the 21st century, in which customers themselves and humans really, at the end of the day, are becoming much more involved one way or another with the electricity system. And so as that occurs, what's happening in this country is Australia is becoming one of the world's most decentralised electric systems. In other words, by 2050, it's very plausible that depending on the scenarios you're looking at, between 30 and 50% of our annual volume of electricity. So that is megawatt hours. It's not just instantaneous supply. This is megawatt hours or gigawatt hours per annum. So up to about 50% of our annual generation requirements being delivered at the polar opposite end of the system from which it was originally designed. And so you're transitioning to make up a word, a deeply hybridized system that includes still large-scale renewables, but very deep penetration of decentralized renewables, energy storage, and so on. And ultimately, when you think about what that means, it really comes to this notion of the 4Ds of electricity sector disruption, and with every disruption is an opportunity, right? So the 4Ds being digitalisation, decarbonisation, decentralisation, and democratisation. And with that democratisation, or perhaps underpinning the democratisation, is a level of distrust in traditional actors and institutions. And all of that actually leads to a dynamic of deep customer empowerment. Recognizing, though, that that empowerment is also it is somewhat stratified. It's not equally distributed across all customer types. And so there are some real social justice, social equity considerations in all that as well that need to be engaged in any consideration of a human-centered energy system. In other words, it's a real trap to think about a human-centered future that really is only conceiving of that with a very limited span of view, if you like, as to which particular humans we're talking about. Are they wealthier families, for example, or are they also perhaps people who are in more challenging circumstances who may actually be having a hard time paying their electricity bill today? What does that future look like for them as well? If I was to try and put all that in two sentences, or it would be along these lines. I think that the revolution we're talking about is from a highly centralised fossil fuel one-way delivery system that's providing a commoditised service to largely passive consumers to a decentralised, digitised, low-carbon electron transaction system that's orchestrating millions of privately owned energy resources and providing almost infinite customer choice. So that, I think, is really just an attempt to try and communicate what is it that's happening across the, if you like, the electron commons or the electricity ecosystem. What is the transformation that's occurring? How do we articulate that in relatively short form? And this is really just a case of meet the power system of the future. At least, 50% of our power system of the future is the aggregated distributed energy resources of many different types, including demand response, energy storage, microgrids, distributed fossil fuel generation, electric vehicles, smart inverters, and so on. So you've got a diversity of technologies and so on that are both behind the meter and also connected to the distribution system that in the past were just not even part of the equation. So if you think about what that means, and you're thinking about what is it going to take to survive or thrive in this transition, what's, if you like, the fundamental DNA that is required to, well, even just to survive, but ideally to survive, to thrive. And if you think about railways for a moment, I mentioned of those example industries that perhaps forgot what particular problem, valuable problem they were solving for humans, or at least their products experienced product substitution. In other words, as the vehicle, the private vehicle, and as air travel became more accessible, their own products became eclipsed, if you like. And the traditional energy system has really operated for a whole range of reasons around, if you like, an authoritative command and control type model. Whereas the world we're tracking into, not will track into, the world we are tracking into right now, is that the leadership will require, if you like, trusted ecosystem facilitation and leadership. So the ability to command and control an increasingly dynamic and, if you like, ecosystemic power system erodes and really becomes much more embedded in a ecosystem leadership model. And by the way, I'm speaking as someone who has been as part of the executive team of a utility, so this is not just kind of abstractions. It can sound like abstractions, but ultimately what we're talking about here is consistent with the disruption that's playing out across many sectors. We just happen to be talking about it with regard to the power system. One of the things that I tend to really want to emphasize is to ask the question, is our theory of change actually commensurate with the scale of change and the type of change that we're experiencing? What do I mean by that? Again, it sounds a little academic. What I mean by that is, maybe let's just go back to the 1930s when, in fact, the 1920s, when they began building the Sydney Harbour Bridge. They were remarkably clever back in the 1920s in the sense that they understood that to build such a bridge, they needed to begin from both the south bank of the harbour and the north side of the harbour simultaneously, and they needed those two spans to meet in the centre. And ultimately, if you have a theory of change that is designed for incremental change, and you're trying to apply that to a period of transformational change or mega shifts, don't be surprised if your model of change is completely outpaced and inadequate in that context. And I think the transition that where this, I think, is a helpful metaphor is that in foundational periods of change, transformational change, you need to bring both a present forward and a future back model of change to bear. In other words, you need to build from the present current state, if you like, the south bank of the harbour, and simultaneously be building from the emerging future state back toward the present. So it is not one or the other, and we tend to focus mostly on one, i.e. building from the present forward, and neglect the future back. And really what we're saying here is that you need to bring both very clearly into view, and that emerging decentralized system needs to be understood as far more than just a technological system or even a techno-economic system. It's ultimately a socio-techno-economic system, because the electricity system, as we've been discussing, increasingly is becoming that ecosystemic whole in which humans, society, are much more dynamically engaged. So if I was to think about that in terms of, so what does this mean for organizational design, strategy, and governance to be human-centric? So if any, obviously probably most people on this webinar have been, well, we've all been consumers and customers of the electricity system. Many of us have probably spent many years working with the electricity system. And usually if your psychologist had you on the couch and asked you, for word association, I'm saying electricity system, what comes to mind? Perhaps human-centric solutions may not be the first things that come to mind from deep in your consciousness. But humans are funny, aren't we, in the sense that we can go through management fads and we can learn the language of the latest fad, and perhaps the latest fad might be human-centric design, for example. And so we can easily learn to parrot the words and the concepts without really doing the hard work of thinking through, well, what actually is required, what is the DNA that must be embedded in an organization to do the hard work of transforming from probably a fairly bottom line centric or self-centric organizational posture to a genuinely customer centric or human centric posture. And in some of the work that I've done, I ended up coming up with 5, from a lot of the literature and professional experience, 5 foundational elements of what is embedded in actually even beginning that journey, and then another 10 enabling elements of that transition itself. And I'll just give you the 5 foundational elements, really, which are stated in very short form, but I'll just try and add a little bit of color here. But ultimately, the corporate intent needs to come from a very considered, explicit, and deliberate commitment from the top, including the board and the entire executive, that such a transition to reorient an organization around humans and customers is absolutely mission critical, is non-negotiable, and is going to be driven by and accountable, and the board and executive are going to be accountable for that significant shift in focus and the reality of that. But it needs to be manifest in a focused consumer experience strategy. It needs to be lived out by the enterprise leadership, not just parroted in words, but it needs to be, people need to be seeing that change of posture is the lived experience of leaders. That there needs to be single point of customer experience accountability on the executive, and there needs to be a deliberate effort to embed, if you like, empathy in the values of the business, knowing that, for example, empathy is the key first point of design thinking, that you actually need to build a culture that becomes skilled and capable of putting ourselves in our customers' shoes, in all of the diversity of our respective customers, the people, the humans that we serve. I know some of that on face value is probably no big surprises there, but there's a lot of depth that sits underneath each of those. And I would probably just say this, that the core DNA of that, if you sort of dig right into that and you say, well, yes, but it's all nice, but it can still be all stuff that's kind of on paper or parroted kind of, if you like, a less than complete embodiment of those things. Here's what I think is ultimately the core DNA of any organization that shifts. It needs to involve the firm having an ethical belief and commitment that the only pathway to enduring profitability, particularly in a disruptive culture, is the ongoing creation of solutions to other humans' needs and aspirations, with their value and utility being defined by them and not by you. So in other words, one of the things that I would, as part of the executive at the utility that I was with, I would actually challenge the thought. I said, you know what, I think that for all of our talk about customer centricity, I think one of the things that we really grapple with is, do we actually believe that we will improve our bottom line as we focus on delivering true value to customers? Or is it actually a trade-off? Is it somehow a zero-sum game in that? And I think the core DNA of an enterprise truly making the shift has to come from the top, and it has to come from a genuine ethical belief that there's actually no other way, no enduring pathway to long-term profitability than deeply understanding human needs and aspirations, and in a sense, humbly creating solutions to that are the value of which is defined by those others and not by you. So let me just take this to a practical level as to what does this mean for what you might call a win-win-win electric system. So a human-centered electric system, if we're thinking about this as the multi-directional system of the 21st century that we were talking about, and we're thinking about a goal here is that how does this become a good for all electric system that, circle one, addresses individual customer goals. So different individual customers, residential, industrial, commercial, they have specific and different goals. How do those individual goals be met? How can they be met in a way that is complementary to the efficiency of the shared infrastructure? Because that's essential. It's essential that this is a shared platform. We can't just meet individual customer goals without doing that in a way that erodes the efficiency and the viability of the commons. So how do we do that to improve the efficiency of the system? And how do we do that such that it delivers benefits back to the community and government interests that are able to support all of the folks that may or may not be able to participate in the distributed energy revolution? So what that looks like in practice is, for example, creating the mechanisms for DER grid services to be rewarded, for example, by VEDA tariffs or value of DER tariffs that reward the provision of meaningful physics-based services from DERs, privately owned DERs, to the shared system. That actually results in the moderation of unfavorable DER behaviors, and OPEX and CAPEX efficiencies. That in itself helps stabilize the economic viability of the utility, particularly in the duck curve environment, and supports enhanced equity for all customer types, including those who don't have DERs. And then I'm chasing myself around the screen here, which I'm hoping you can't see. And that delivers quality of supply outcomes for all and an expanding range of offerings for all customer segments. So in other words, key point here is, how do we think, not as a zero-sum game, but how do we create virtuous circles, meaningful, physics-based, economics-based, societally-based virtual circles in the way we think about the redesign, the whole of system redesign of our electric systems. And ultimately, I just want to finish with a couple of interesting case studies, just two, but I'll make this point that great design creates solutions that go viral. We all, probably most of us, have a smartphone in our pockets. Those smartphones have huge complexity under the hood, complexity that most of us have perhaps maybe some discipline expertise in some of those areas, but a huge range of disciplines embedded in that device that we don't need to master. But why are they so popular? Why is that expensive device so almost ubiquitous? Because it has gone viral because the great design has embodied a whole range of solutions in that one device, which has then gone viral. And I think that's essentially the point we're saying here is designing around the value that others define for themselves. So let's think about that virtuous circle of electricity systems, and we're trying to achieve what individual customers want. We're trying to achieve some efficiencies for the shared system, and we're trying to do that in a way that takes the pressure off the cost of the system to everybody and make sure that we all get a stable, reliable supply of electricity. So one of those examples has been a long-standing challenge around residential air conditioning peak demand. And exactly the same matter can address the belly of the duct. So peak demand is the head of the duct. The belly of the duct is the middle of the day, where you've got inadequate demand on the system and excessive supply of solar PV. In ye olde world, as I refer to it, ye olde world was the authoritative command and control approach. And typically there would be very centralized solutions to rolling out, if you like, solutions that weren't terribly well designed for customer needs. So it would involve shutting down air conditioning systems altogether. It would mean blacking out particular segments of the network. There was no commercial ecosystem to actually support the solution, so on. So it was all difficult, complicated, and it was designed primarily to serve the needs of the utility. I think by contrast, the trusted ecosystem facilitator model was really about saying, well, let's deeply understand how customers actually use that type of appliance, whether it's air conditioning or pool filtration or solar PV or hot water, whatever it is. Let's sit at the feet of our customers and say, help me understand how you actually use this solution, this technology, so that we can not impose some control mechanism on it, but we can design a solution that achieves that virtuous circle, that actually finds a sweet spot for you as a customer, for the system as a technological system, and for society as a whole. And so in this case, Energex applied, if you like, a model of designing around the technology, the customer value proposition, and the channel to market to really create a solution that customers love, that the commercial ecosystem love, that every time you buy an air conditioner in Queensland, the Harvey Norman salesperson will actually encourage you to have or to install the what they call positive payback as a solution that enables the very occasional management of that device in a way that's almost imperceptible to consumers, but in a way that actually delivers significant system optimization for society, shares some value with the consumer, and does all that in a way that takes some pressure off the system for everybody that's using it. One last example that I'd give you is one from Horizon Power, and the challenge being how can we reduce the costs and risks of long remote feeders, long electric lines serving a few customers. And this is in the context where standalone power systems, or SAPs, are still immature and expensive. And so the problem, I guess it was about reconceiving the problem. Traditional electric utility answer to this would be, we're going to install some more tech. And basically when we sort of thought about this, what we were really saying was, actually customers aren't terribly interested in the tech. They aren't terribly interested in the quarter-inch drill. They certainly want a quarter-inch hole. In other words, they want a full electric utility service offering that just doesn't need to have poles and wires. And we want to deliver that as an entirely new utility asset class. And so that solution was, again, from a trusted ecosystem facilitator or leader, it's about deeply understanding what customers are trying to do when they're needing a remote electric service, but are there more efficient ways of doing that? What are the things they're afraid of in making that transition? How do we work with them on that? You need to evaluate the national and global ecosystem to actually deliver the kind of solutions, or what role do you play in facilitating that emerging ecosystem to bring together all of the elements to be able to deploy an entirely new set of solutions designed around customers. And in this particular case, there's a world first where Horizon Power, by working very closely with consumers, with working with the commercial ecosystem, with really bringing together best-in-class elements, was really able to, as I say, in a world-first manner, disconnect, de-energize and remove 54 kilometres of remote, aging and high-risk poles and wires in the Esperance region, and replace all, I think it was 20-something properties on that 54 kilometres of high-risk line with off-grid solutions that fundamentally provided a full utility service offering, just didn't need poles and wires, and was actually much more reliable and exactly the same cost for consumers. So just another great example of taking a very customer-centric or human-centered approach to reimagining what those solutions might look like. So I think if I was to conclude with this slide, it would be that that navigating transition really does require organisations to learn fast and integrate diverse inputs to design and lead change, and not simply respond to it. And I think Peter Fox-Penner's quote here from his book Smart Power, I think, really nails it. He's a economist engineer from the Brattle Group, and he essentially just, in short form, says, look, this is a super complex sector, that there's huge revolution going on around control systems and technologies, economics, regulatory processes, and so on. But really the core issue here is how we provision the industry for change, and the intelligence, and actually create more intelligent institutions to navigate this transition to a deeply customer-centric, human-centric future. And in fact, I would argue that, as I've stated from the beginning, that really, in whatever industry you're in, including the power sector, you really have no viable future, at least no flourishing future, if you do not become very adept at understanding deeply what other humans are trying to achieve, and creating knockout value for them that helps them do that, to which they then, of their own volition, say, you know what, that is so good, I would like to give you some of my hard-earned in return for this great solution you've developed to the problem or the ambition that I have. So I'll pause there and maybe go to questions if you have any.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation, Mark. So for those of you who submit questions, I'll be inviting you to unmute your audio and you can ask the questions live. And if you're not able to do so, I can ask the question on your behalf. So just be reminded before asking a question, please introduce yourself with both your name and affiliation. So first off the rank, I'd like to invite Roger East to ask his question.
Hello, look, I'm an electrical engineer, retired, been in the power industry for many, many years. I guess I actually raised two questions. One, at the moment, particularly in major urban areas, the systemic issues actually dictate what the people can do with the system. So there's numerous instances of solar PV being ramped back and stuff like that. So that's not taking the customer's interest to heart, and they don't understand why. And the other question I have is, in the future, how interdependent will this control system be on the internet? In other words, we'll now have a a society extremely dependent not only on electricity, but also on the internet. And so if either goes down, particularly if the internet goes down, we can have some major systemic issues.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think so two good questions, and I think on the first one, one of the real challenges with this is a balancing act in many ways, the transition of the electric system, simply because, as we all know, the 20th century system wasn't designed for tens of thousands, indeed hundreds of thousands of small, highly variable generation systems connected at the distribution level. And it is a physics-based system, so those pesky laws of physics tend to kind of impose their own will on the system. So there are real challenges with integrating very significant volumes of DERs to any particular network element, and hence, as you mentioned, Roger, there's the propensity of some utilities to impose hosting capacity limits and manage and turn off, if you like, the export function at particular points of time. So all of that, in some respects, is understandable within limits, and I guess there is a propensity in the sector to always err on the side of very conservative course of action. Again, that's completely understandable in the sense that none of us want the power system to be going down. I think where it really becomes a key issue is, how as a society do we actually set the new rules of the road for what we all collectively agree is acceptable in terms of what are the ways that, what are the parameters within which we would expect utilities to be able to manage off resources that are in fact placing the system at risk, and to what extent should they, what are the other functions that really should be monetized or should be remunerated? So there is always going to be in any of these things a question of how much do you control and how much do you incentivize through markets? So technological control and market-based optimization. And some of that, I mentioned to Kelvin earlier on the call that I've got the privilege of doing some work with the Energy Security Board's post-2025 project, and certainly a number of these matters are being considered at some length in terms of that controls and markets relationship. On the other matter, Roger, I guess you're absolutely right that obviously more greater dependence on single technologies, and talking about the internet, is certainly a key source of fragility in the system. And so I think it's fair to say that designing for resilience in the situation where it's not an if, but a when any of these systems actually do fail at certain points of time. And so any system needs to have inbuilt redundancy and the ability to continue operations, without need for undisrupted internet connection, for example. Obviously, that has time limitations, but building for redundancy and anti-fragility, to use the term, is a critical consideration in any whole system design.
Thank you. So I'll ask Trevor Gould now to speak.
Thanks, Mark. Trevor Gould, I'm the National Policy Officer with the Electrical Trades Union. I guess interested in this concept of the prosumer and who benefits and the hierarchy of the prosumer, I suppose. So my question's about thinking about wholesale demand response and grappling with the impacts of turning off or winding down an entity's operations to either meet the network needs or to maximise profits for the business, and what happens to the workforce, for example. So is the business the consumer, or is the workforce the consumer? And then sort of moving on from that, is if the business is a business that supplies services, such as a nursing home or even a school, for example, who receives the priority in the decision to cut or reduce demand? And how is the customer, the student or the nursing home resident, actually at the centre of that decision?
Yep. Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's a really good set of questions. So here's my personal professional opinion. So I think the interesting thing about a lot of these things is that there are a whole set of trade-off decisions that we all have to deal with on a daily basis, and we do that around our kitchen tables all the time. And we teach our kids, hopefully, look, you can only have so many lollies, but you do need to eat your vegetables and your Brussels sprouts. So there's this kind of trade-off thing that we know is implicit to life in a world like this. And I think often where that comes home in the sort of questions you're raising, Trevor, is my starting point with all this is that the electricity system doesn't actually exist for itself. It exists for the humans and the customers and the people that it actually serves. That's why it exists. And when we forget that is when that system, that technology, those corporations are at serious risk of failure, if not tomorrow, at some point in the foreseeable future. I think the question of things like wholesale demand side response, and so on, really need to be considered. So the order of priority, typically, and there's always going to be trade-offs here, but the order of priorities in principle needs to be, what is it that business needs to continue its operations, and the workers, particularly in terms of, to your question, how does it actually affect the people that are working in that business? And what is is there a specific trade-off of significant value to all of the above that by shutting down some piece of infrastructure or something for a period of time because of extreme peak demand, what is the trade-off that occurs there, and how is the business, and for that matter, the staff, what are the negotiations that occur that actually make that viable for all of the above? In other words, as a basic principle, we spend a lot of time creating vicious circles when sometimes it's simply a lack of imagination and, I think, intent to find a virtuous circle, which often is somewhere in the same space. In other words, what would it look like to negotiate an arrangement with our staff that where if it actually turns out that it actually makes a lot of sense to shut down this infrastructure and send people home early on that particular afternoon, how do we actually share even just a portion of the value with our staff if in fact they're impacted in some way? I think human-centric design doesn't just apply to consumers or customers. It applies to the way we deal with our staff, who ultimately are our customers if you're a leader in an organization. I know it's a very big question, Trevor, and I've only scratched the surface, but I'm hoping that at least goes some way to addressing it.
Thank you. Now I'd like to invite Jonathan Knock to ask a question on the standalone power system.
Hi, Mike. Thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting. Just wondering if you could go into a little bit more detail about your example two, specifically about, if you have any details on the solution that was implemented and how that would differ from a SAPS, please. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So there's a whole range of equipment that has been deployed in that particular project. As I say, about 20 properties have been taken off the grid completely. I think the main things that differ from standalone power systems, there's a wide spectrum of different solutions that fall into that basic definition. Everything from very expensive, high quality solutions deployed on mining facilities, right through to, so you're talking many millions of dollars, through to something that's been essentially thrown together in the local Sparky's garage, which is, some energy storage, some solar panels, a bespoke control system deployed at, 10 or 20 grand to a local property, for example. I think between those two extremes, the solutions that we were deploying in Horizon Power and are deploying still, where it becomes an integrated part of the utility infrastructure is that it needs the control architecture to be integrated back into the back office of the utility itself, such that and such that all of the management of the system, its refueling, so all operations basically are managed centrally from the utility control center, which has the ability to scale up to thousands, indeed tens of thousands of units, as very large numbers of properties are actually taken off the grid because of the efficiencies of doing so. And so it takes it into a very different situation from being just simply a low cost, do-it-yourself kind of system that you ultimately are completely responsible to manage, through to a solution that really is designed to operate seamlessly, exactly the same as if you had a grid connection, in fact more reliably so, and doing that, in potentially the thousands or tens of thousands of sites.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you. I'd like to invite Gabrielle Breen to come and ask a question.
Oh, hi. Hi, Mark. It's Gabrielle from Delphin, Victoria. How are you going? And thanks for the talk. So yeah, really interesting ideas. And I'm just wondering, I guess at that kind of higher order level for the energy system, and we're looking at the overall governance arrangements, which in Australia are quite complicated, where you see there might be some practical opportunities to better embed a consumer-centric approach. So say in our governance arrangements, or maybe there are other strategies aside from governance. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Gabrielle. So, excuse me, that's maybe one of the biggest questions of them all so far. So I think that there are initiatives that are on foot where this is happening. I think it is actually part of that, as I probably suggested in my presentation. My personal view is this concept of human centricity and customer centricity, despite our many words affirming such notions in the sector over the last 5 years or so. I think it's still it's at the heart of the struggle to reimagine what we are. And so such struggles don't happen or they're not completed overnight. They require, in a lot of ways, something of a grassroots movement to keep them alive, and really just a dogged resolve to say, what we've got has worked well, and it's good as far as it goes, but it's actually, we need something different for the 21st century. And that will manifest at a number of different levels. One level is the formal governance models and so on, and things such as the post-2025 program of work, as I say, I think is pushing in that direction, and I think that's a really good initiative. I think there's other levels of work which are kind of more democracy 2.0, if you like, where parts of the sector, if you like, cluster together and really push hard to develop things like the consumer. I'm just trying to think of the name of it. It's the essentially the consumer mandate. I can't. The name escapes me right now. There's a number of utilities that have really signed on to, and actors signed on to, a specific set of principles and actions that, you know, give life to a more customer-centric future. There are particular organisations that I think ultimately a lot of leadership just really comes down to key humans in the ecosystem who provide, you know, compelling leadership and demonstrating by their actions and by their, you know, their considered risk taking to say, you know what, we're not just going to talk about this, we're going to get out there and we're going to do it. In a sense, here's, you know, this maybe just as a glib kind of comment, one of my conclusions about observing life is that I think change only happens when two things happen. One large group of people become very jealous and another group of people become very embarrassed. So in other words, helping people see that there's a better way and saying, well, you know what, we really should be lifting our sights for what we expect of any industry, including the energy system. And then for the folks who really are insisting on the ways of the 18th, 19th and 20th century really are adequate for the 21st century, we should help them to be at least a little bit embarrassed. So.
Great. That's really great. Thank you. I like that approach.
So we'll ask about enough time for maybe one more question from Rowan Burns.
Hello there, Mark. Yes, right on the MONEY, I would say, yes. I mean, in a situation where we have still those basic principles in play and social equity right now, I mean, it could be the song, The Funk's So Heavy, yeah? But it's definitely interesting, yeah? Here's the question. Yeah. What do you consider maybe a rational form after the COVID in regards to grid development moving forward in Australia? And there are ways forward which surely and rationally can be identifiable even now. What about the retail and distribution concepts and the next step to link them all together?
You just faded out for part of the question. Are you able to summarise the question again, Rowan, or maybe Kelvin?
Yeah, Kelvin, if you'd like to go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so it's just asking about COVID recovery and grid development and how retail and distribution concepts, should they be connected or brought together going forward?
Well, just a couple of small questions there, Rowan. So let me just have a bit of I'll scratch the surface a little bit here. So look, I think ultimately it's easy to say things like we want to build back better and so on, but clearly that's pretty obvious that we should. And I think that when we build back better on any topic, you need to be applying a more whole of system approach to what that means. In other words, a lot of initiatives that we undertake, including in this sector, but in other sectors, can tend to be very reductionistic. In other words, we focus on incentivizing, for example, the deployment of solar PV, but we don't simultaneously incentivize, let's say, for example, energy storage or demand response or the ability to load shift. So in other words, if you want to have, we all know that buying a vehicle with 3 wheels is probably not a great idea, that you probably need to buy a car with 4 wheels to have a functioning system, unless it's a tricycle. And in a lot of ways, that's been a bit of our approach to some of these problems, is that we satisfy ourselves with, if you like, the ability for a minister to cut a ribbon somewhere and a press release, but not really a complete systemic approach to say, well, what would we need to do to actually achieve benefits for the individual consumer benefits for the shared system, that is a physics-based system, and benefits for the societal long-run outcomes in terms of how do we actually rebalance the way that this is actually the cost of this system and how we actually share the costs of that. I think, that sort of, just maybe to conclude with this, to the question of distribution and resale, obviously we have a vertically disaggregated structure, and I think the reality of what's happening is that, and this is a global dynamic, is that regardless of market structure, the notion of a hybridized energy system where you've got a world where 50% of your generation fleet is at polar opposite ends of the system. So 50% is connected to the transmission system, 50% connected to the distribution system. You need a much more interoperable system from top to bottom. And you've probably all heard the term value stacking. There's a lot of services that DERs can provide, but you need to be able to value stack and dispatch those services, the right service at the right location at the right time. So there's a lot of co-optimization that needs to occur there. I think in reality, regardless of what the market structure is, what we're seeing is a need for levels of virtual reaggregation, if you like, through platforms and so on, to be able to co-optimize the function of these solutions located at different parts of the system to operate in a way that is more like a symphony of instruments than just a, if you like, discordant set of noises. So again, I've scratched the surface for your question, but hopefully that's at least some useful reflections.
Thank you. So given that we've got 1 minute to go, I'll thank you for your presentation, Mark. It's been absolutely wonderful to hear how all these concepts are coming together and that they really sit at the top of where the direction should go and form that central pillar of vision. So before everyone leaves, I'd just like to introduce our next webinar. So we've got our upcoming events. Please visit the Climate Energy College and Energy Transition websites. And the next webinar will be from the Climate Energy College, and it's called Safeguarding Biodiversity and Carbon Dioxide Removal Approaches. So we've got 3 alumni from our Climate Energy College, and we'll be presenting at 11 AM on Wednesday on the 9th of December. So once again, thank you everyone for attending, and thank you so much, Mark, for presenting all that useful knowledge for us to take advantage of.
Thanks, Colin. Thanks, everyone.